All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. This is the SHRF Align Grant webinar. So I'm Chelsea Cunningham. I'm the programs manager here at SHRF, and I am the one in charge of the Align Grant. So today I'm going to be talking, just kind of going through the application package, um, a little bit about SHRF, and some tips and tricks for doing your Align Grant application. Before I get into the presentation, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that SHRF is located here in Saskatoon, which is Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. But that SHRF really serves everyone in the province of Saskatchewan, and all peoples and all lands and all treaty territories in Saskatchewan. And we try to do everything mindful of that. So a little bit of housekeeping before I get into our agenda. So I have about half an hour worth of slides, I think, here. And then at the end, there will be some time for questions. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted on SHRF's YouTube afterwards for the rest of the year as it applies to next Align Grant intake as well. But for the question period, we usually stop the recording. So you're welcome to either throw questions in the chat and I'll answer them, or you can unmute yourself and raise your hand and ask questions as well that way. And you won't be posted on our YouTube. I think that's all housekeeping wise. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'll start off with a little bit of the background of who SHRF actually is and what our purpose is. And then I'll get into the line grant details, including who can apply, how you apply, and some key takeaways. So first, if you're not familiar, SHRF, or the Saskatchewan Health Research Foundation, is the provincial agency that funds, supports, and promotes the impact of health research that matters to Saskatchewan. So we are publicly funded. We get our funding through the government of Saskatchewan through Innovation Saskatchewan. And then we take that money and reinvest it in health research here in Saskatchewan. When I say health research, I'm referring to any field, discipline, methodology that may address or improve human health. So common goals for our research include things like developing new medicines and treatments, strengthening the healthcare and related systems, but also just generally improving the health of the people in Saskatchewan in any form. We invest in health research through a few different grant competitions. Generally, all of our funding programs work together to advance our SHRF strategic goals, which are to strengthen research capacity and competitiveness in Saskatchewan, increase investment in research and innovation, and align research with stakeholder needs. We are publicly funded, so our main interest holders that we're accountable to is the public of Saskatchewan. And generally, our grants get grouped into these four pillars or envelopes. And so today we're focusing on connection, which has the Align grant in it. So the purpose of the Align grant, it's designed to support projects and activities that will align research in Saskatchewan with real needs and position teams for impact. These impacts can include securing future funding, strengthening collaboration, implementing improvements in health, providing training opportunities, and generally creating capacity for the province. So you might be wondering how we determine if something is addressing real needs. That's mostly through consultation and alignment with interest holders. So these are the people or organizations who have an interest in your research or are affected by its outcomes. So that includes communities, people with lived and living experience, families, informal caregivers, decision makers, health practitioners, healthcare administrators, educators, policymakers, patient groups, community-based organizations, industry, and health charities. That is a long list, but it's not exhaustive, I mean. So depending on your field, who your interest holders will vary. But generally, for the Align grant to show that you are aligning research with real needs, a good starting point is to reach out and work with your interest holders. The Line Grant has some specific objectives that applications need to address for funding. So specifically, the Align Grant is to support new opportunities for research funding and real-world impacts in Saskatchewan. This provides funding for teams to complete activities that will aid them in building momentum for novel ideas, approaches, collaborations, and perspectives in order to successfully pursue their identified future research funding. So there's a lot of words on there. It's basically we're trying to give you a little bit of a head start to do the best you can at whatever comes next for your field. We do see a very diverse set of applications to this funding opportunity because we are open to all areas of health research. So context plays a big role in determining what is eligible and what isn't. Generally, I came up with some examples that I've seen from previously successful projects and what their specific goals in their application were that aligned well with the Align Grant objectives. And so this included things like they were aiming to recruit and engage non-academic team members and supporters to strengthen their future funding and to make sure that they were going in a direction that would be relevant to real-world needs later on. There's also a lot of embedding knowledge translation into the research process, preliminary work to identify gaps in current practice, and determining feasibility of interventions, models, or protocols. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just what I came up with looking at all of our previously successful applications and trying to find some common goals and themes across them. And then there is a note that the Align Grant is not intended to provide continuous support or operating costs for ongoing research. So one of the things that we're looking for is how is the Align Grant pushing your work to the next level, whatever that next level might be, which ties into the future funding requirement that I talk about in a slide or two. A few more just grant details before I get into the application requirements. So you're allowed to request up to 10,000 for 1 year. SHRF is very generous with extensions. We know, especially when you're doing research that is working with interest holders and communities, things happen. It never goes exactly as planned. Generally, your timeline should be feasible within an ideal 1 year scenario. But if you run into issues or delays with getting ethics or getting out to the community and coordinating meetings, don't stress. We will give you an extension as long as you are still in Saskatchewan and working on the project, essentially. So one other slight change for this year, we're only going to do 2 deadlines. So we're doing the first deadline is March 31st, and then the second deadline is October 1st. So that corresponds to a funding start date of May 1st or November 1st. At SHRF, our deadlines are always 4:30 p.m. CST. So it's always nice to get things done a little bit ahead of the deadline. It can get a little hectic on deadline day if there's things happening in the system and a lot of people trying to figure out what's going on. But we're also generally fairly understanding if the system crashes and you aren't able to hit submit at 4:30, send us an email ASAP and we will help you. And then I have one other note on a change regarding the 2 deadlines. So it's always been a rule that we only allow one application per principal applicant per deadline. So if you're submitting an application on March 31st, you should only be submitting one. You are allowed to be a co-applicant or a co-principal applicant on other people's grants that they're submitting on March 31st, but only one for yourself. And then this year, we are also limiting it to one successful application per principal applicant per fiscal year. This doesn't apply to Align funding you received in the past, as that is in a different fiscal year, and it won't apply to Align grant funding you apply for next year, because that will also be a new fiscal year. Essentially just applies to if you get funded on the March 31st intake, then you won't be applying again on October 1st. And then just a little shout out here, if you want to look at some examples of what's been funded in the past, we post all of these onto our website. The link is there. Feel free to check those out and see what types of projects have been funded previously. Okay, I'm just going to take. So now this is getting into the important stuff here. So starting off with who can apply. So this is where I'll go through the requirements that you need to put in an application. So first I talked about the rules about principal applicants only having one application. SHRF's definition for principal applicant is found in our funding guide, and it applies to the Align grant as well. This is the person who's taking responsibility for the grant. You can have co-leads, co-principal applicants on your grant, but the main principal applicant is the one who is agreeing to adhere to all SHRF's funding policies and reporting requirements, and actually signing for the grant and agreeing to do all the financial reporting, etc. on it. In addition, the principal applicant must reside and work in Saskatchewan during the funding period of the grant. I know virtual work from home is becoming more prevalent. If you have a position at the U of S or the U of R or any other place in Saskatchewan, we don't ask for proof of address, but generally you should be based in Saskatchewan, and that should be apparent from your position. Principal applicants also cannot be trainees. You should be independent in regards to the project being proposed. And you'll have to be able to get a signed approval page from a research office at an institution that has an MOU with SHRF. I've added this one because generally this is assistant professors and equivalent or above, but some of our institutions have a little different system in who can hold peer review funding. So if you have a position that you think is eligible for Align, your best starting point is probably with your research office to see if you're able to hold peer review fundings. And then you can also reach out to me at SHRF just to confirm that all the other checkboxes for principal applicant are being met. A few additional things to consider. As I mentioned, the PI, you should be submitting only one application at a time. And then if you are submitting in October, you should have not received funding in May. So just a little checklist here for you to confirm. And here is a list of the current institutions that have a memorandum of understanding with SHRF. So it's all the post-secondary institutions and the health authority. Applications are also required to intend to apply for future research funding after receiving the Align. So the way I have worded that this year is that you need to indicate intent to apply for at least one additional external research funding opportunity for the project with one year of the Align grant conclusion. So it's from the end date. So I understand if things are delayed, I don't expect you to still submit a giant grant proposal when your Align isn't finished yet. But it should be clear in your proposal that the intent is there, that the Align grant, if it works out, is providing you a foundation to move up to these next funding opportunities. It's also, so it has to be at least one research funding opportunity, but it is also nice to see other funding opportunities. If there's some offshoots coming out of your project where it's very implementation focused, and one of the goals is to get sustainable funding to operate whatever program you are offering, including that in your future plans can also really strengthen applications. But it's not a requirement of the project. There's also some team requirements on this funding opportunity. So the only actual requirement is to include at least one Saskatchewan-based trainee. But we do strongly encourage you to consider applying with co-applicants and supportive and other supporters to be competitive. I know this trainee requirement, we have got a lot of valid questions about this since it's kind of a chicken and the egg situation of it's hard to hire the trainee before the funding's in place. But the rationale has been that since these are such short grants with a quick turnaround, they do want to see that there's at least one trainee in place so that they're not facing huge hiring delays. The compromise I have come up with that is that you only need to have at least one trainee on the grant. Um, if not everyone you need for the grant is hired yet, that's okay. That won't be um, held against you in the review process. You just need to be able to check that box that at least one trainee is named on the grant. And then in reference to those other co-applicants and supporters I mentioned, for SHRF applications, individuals and organizations fall into one of these three categories. And then this corresponds to the application of where you invite the individual by email onto the grant. So there's a section for co-applicants. These are individuals contributing to the intellectual, cultural, or scientific direction of the project. And there's three subtypes of co-applicants, which I'll go into on the next slide. There's also a section for adding your personnel. So this is where anyone being paid to do the work of the grant essentially is being listed. So that's staff and trainees. And then there's also a section for supporters. So these are the individuals or organizations who provide a limited and defined role in the project or have a general interest in the proposed outcomes. So the types of co-applicants I mentioned, all three of these categories SHRF considers as co-applicants, and they can be added into that section accordingly. So first we have the researchers. These are the individuals with formal training and hold a position that supports them to pursue research. We also have our knowledge users, who are the individuals interested in the applications of the knowledge generated from the proposed research. They may also have that frontline work experience of how things happen in the real world. So they become very relevant for ensuring that real world impact and alignment. We also have people with lived experience. These are the individuals who support the project through their personal experience with a health issue or experience as an informal caregiver. So again, they bring that perspective that may help guide the context of the project and address the gaps and needs for patients from that lens. I do get a question a lot. There's a fair amount of overlap between co-applicants and supporters. Generally, if you're not sure which one a person is falling into, the question is determined by what level they're contributing to the project. So say, for example, a knowledge user, you have a clinician who is interested in your findings and is going to come to team meetings and provide some commentary or perspective and helping interpret your results or figure out what's next. That would probably be a co-applicant amount of involvement. If they're writing a letter of support saying that they are interested in your results and look forward to seeing what happens after the project's done, that's probably a supporter level where they're interested, but they're not necessarily contributing. I also have a few notes about expenses for this grant. So most of this is coming from the SHRF funding guide, which applies to all SHRF projects. But generally speaking, the following are not eligible for aligned grants. So that's overhead and operating cost, equipment, which we define as something that has a useful life beyond the scope of the grant. One question that comes up a lot is things like iPads. Um, if the iPad is staying in the community after you use it, it no longer has a useful life for your research team, and therefore we don't consider it equipment. If it's something that is going to live in your lab as infrastructure, more likely that's equipment. And it's a good idea to reach out to me first and see if it's eligible or if an exception can be approved for it. We also don't allow academic dissemination. So that's your things like manuscript publication fees, conference travel, etc. If you're not sure if something is considered academic dissemination, because I have been getting more questions of mixed conferences where you're presenting to a clinician audience and things like that. General rule of thumb, if you just ask yourself if any side of the dissemination activity is someone who doesn't have academic positions, you can probably consider it non-academic dissemination. Again, never hurts to reach out and double check with me if you have questions about that. And we also list activities for the express purpose of preparing a future grant proposal are not allowable expenses. This essentially just refers to like you can't hire an external grant writer to come put together a nice, clean, polished grant for you. You can definitely pay hours for your student to work on things. Just yeah, no grant writers, and I think also academic team meetings are typically not allowable since that is considered part of your position and regular duties to meet with your trainees. Then here's a breakdown of the application requirements. So this is all the documents you'll need to prepare to apply for this funding opportunity. So this is all done in the SHRF RMS. I think I have the link for that on the next page. But these documents are all upload fields in the application. So you'll have your project proposal. It's 3 pages maximum. I have a note here that it should be written in a similar style to larger grant proposals. Since one of the goals of the Align grant is to support teams in success at future funding, we do expect to see that level of quality. I know these are smaller grants, and I don't want to spend more time than it's worth writing the proposal, but we are seeing this competition getting more and more competitive, so please don't submit something in point form. The timeline, you get 1 page maximum, and so this is in addition to your proposal, so you can have a visual chart or some other form of timeline, which can help clarify the proposal and show where everything is happening and when and how it all comes together. You're also given a separate document for a description of roles and responsibilities for the team. This replaces CVs. We don't require you to upload everyone's CV or resume to this application. So when you're doing your roles and responsibilities, make sure that you also include anything that's really relevant for the success of the project. For example, if someone is an expert in whatever methodology you're using, always helpful to note there. There's also an upload field for supplementary materials. There's no required supplementary materials except for I ask people to upload their proposal references here, just to save you some space in your project proposal. There's also a budget that has an Excel template that is downloaded from the application itself, in the browser. So you download the Excel, fill it in, and then re-upload it to auto-populate in the system. This budget it's the same Excel across all our grants. So you'll see multiple different years and categories of budget that may not be relevant for a line. Just fill in the parts that are relevant. So for a line, that would be just the year one column, and you can ignore year two, three, etc. And then you also get a separate budget justification document. So this is a PDF or Word document again. And this is where you get space to explain how you got the numbers that are listed in your budget Excel. And then there's a budget documentation upload field. This is similar to your supplementary materials, but specifically where you can provide supporting quotes, etc. for your budget. Okay, yes. So now we'll get into the how you apply. So this is where we talk about our system and the review process. As I mentioned, applications are done through our research management system, or RMS. So the link is there. I will be sharing these slides after to everyone that's registered as well. Or if you go to SHRF's website, there's a big orange button in the corner that takes you to the RMS. And then as you work through the RMS, there's a few different supporting documents that can be helpful. So most important is the 2026-27 Aligned Grant Application Package. So that's the document that has all the information I'm talking about and more. We do our best to update it every year and make sure that it has helpful information. I do really encourage everyone to read it. I know it's fairly long, but we put thought into it. It's long for information that's there is there for a reason. We also have a SHRF funding guide, which generally has SHRF's policies and procedures. Most of the relevant ones for Align I've either highlighted in this webinar or are highlighted in the application package. But it sometimes has helpful information about, for example, the principal applicant requirements, allowable expenses, things like that. And then we also have an RMS manual. The end of the application package has a fairly detailed instruction section that walks you through the RMS application. But the RMS manual can also help you with things like getting signed up with an account, resetting your password, etc. And then both those documents live on our resources page. Um, you don't have to read those in depth. They're quite long. So then the review process. So it is an internal review since these are less than $25,000, which aligns with our SHRF policies and procedures. And this is so that we can do this faster turnover. We don't want a 6-month process to figure out who's getting this $10,000. Also, a lot of times applications in this opportunity are relying on some community momentum. If you have a community partner that's excited to try something new, you don't necessarily want to have to wait 6 months to know if you're going to be able to do it or not. And applications are assessed by the criteria that are detailed in the application package. As I mentioned, it's really focusing more on the rationale for the proposed activities and the justification and how the proposed activities are preparing the research team for the aligned grant objectives. Those objectives being achieving future funding and real-world impacts. So I just also want to note the review process does not assign importance based on the topic or field relative to other topics or fields. We try to really focus on just the alignment with the aligned grant objectives. As I mentioned, we do get a very diverse set of applications. So these are the 3 broad review criteria. They're outlined in more detail in the application package, and I really recommend going through those point by point. But here I just tried to capture the one sentence summary of what these criteria would mean. So one of the first things is the relevance and feasibility. So that is kind of trying to ask how well have you thought out your project plan and the potential barriers to success. So seeing that there's mitigation plans, that you've checked in with the community and feel confident that this is the direction that will be relevant to them. Things like that all fall under this criteria. We also look at the future directions and capacity, essentially asking, will the potential impacts last? So this is the kind of thing where what are you working towards in your future funding? Are you aiming for future funding in this area, and then that would eventually lead to implementation? Is it solely just, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Um, is it kind of more of like a one and done type thing, which is not necessarily what we're wanting to see here? Things like that. Sustainability ties in a lot if there's an implementation focus on it. And then finally, there's also the criteria for quality of the proposal, which is where it's being asked, would this be competitive at the next level of funding? Or does it inspire confidence that it could be competitive at the next level of funding? Again, it's a small application, We would not expect you to put in the same amount of time as you would to a bigger application, but the quality does play a role in the decisions. Okay, I think that's all of the highlights from the application package to cover. And then I just have a few key takeaways and some tips on the next slide. And then I see a few questions popping up in the chat, which I'll answer those and then open it up. So key takeaways. The principal applicants need to meet the same eligibility criteria for applying to peer-reviewed funding from SHRF. So that principal applicant definition that I went through is important. All topics, fields, stage of research, etc. are welcome to apply. And the application objectives must be met when you're applying. So specifically, you have to have a trainee named to your application. You have to have identified at least one peer-reviewed research funding opportunity that you will intend to apply to in the future. Ideally, not a planning and dissemination grant is great, but that shouldn't be your only future funding opportunity. And your application should have evidence that the direction of your work is at least in part guided by non-academic drivers. So just that context and relevance, even if it's not necessarily engagement with non-academic team members yet, just evidence of some form that you're mindful of the real world impacts and needs. And then a final note, to be competitive, we are seeing more applications to this every year. So these are the minimum project requirements that I listed in the slides. So keep in mind that's the minimum. To be competitive, you should be exceeding those. And then some other application tips that I put together based on what I've been seeing the past year. Showing is better than telling. So a good letter of support can really sell the potential for real world impact as opposed to just stating that it will have real world impact. Um, in a similar example, having the community advisory committee listed as co-applicants is more convincing than saying they exist. I also see this quite a bit come up, but use the proposal space wisely. If you feel like you're repeating information from another section, it's okay to cut it from the proposal and leave it in the other document. So an example of this is describing the role of the team in the roles and responsibilities document, and then again in the proposal without adding any new context to it. I also recommend people keep the background succinct. It is only a 3-page proposal, which is not a lot of space to provide a feasible project plan. So the way I recommend most for how to do this is to keep in mind that the importance of burden of the specific issue or disease is not one of the criteria. So instead of spending a lot of your background space talking about the rates of a disease, the mortality, etc., focus in on the context of which your project is working in and why your proposal would be an important next step to the field or the specific issue being proposed. Also, be realistic. Fewer convincingly feasible objectives usually do better than many insufficiently described objectives. This again emphasizes the importance of using your space wisely, because if you have a lot of really good objectives, but you don't have space to provide the methodology and the plan for how these will actually be carried out, it's usually doesn't do as well. You have to be given the benefit of the doubt by the reviewers, and that's usually a tough sell. So the bigger picture and the larger scope of the objectives are still important for the future directions. But if you're talking about what's next in the future directions, that's some place where you can get away with not having a specific detailed project plan. And the reviewers or readers can still be excited that they know it's going somewhere bigger. That's just not in the scope of this current application. So last, we have contacts. So as I mentioned, I'm the program manager for this funding opportunity, which means um, I answer all the questions and do the screening of the applications once they're submitted to make sure everything's in order. There's one small hiccup this year. So I'm going on holidays next week for 2 weeks, but I will be providing the contact information for my colleague Paulin and Karen here at SHRF. They will cover for me in the meantime, and then aligning grant application project questions will be my top priority when I come back in March. So there's a full month there to work on applications, so everyone should be okay. But I know it wasn't great timing for the holidays, but there was a lot going on the last few months. And then Tanya's always here as well. She's our programs and peer review coordinator. So if something's broken in the RMS or just doesn't seem to be working for some reason, she's the one that usually can figure out how to fix it for us. So you're also welcome to email her directly if you're having technical issues with the application itself. And then this slide will be helpful to be included. So this is just kind of some resources that you can find all of the documents I was referring to. So I will open up the chat box now and answer these two questions and then see if there's any additional questions. So for the first question we're clarifying about those PI requirements. So the question was for the funding in 1 year, could the same PI apply for two different funding calls um, per fiscal year? For example, a line and establishment. Yes. So yeah, what I was saying where it's one per fiscal year, that applies only to a line. You can collect one of every SHRF grant if you really wanted to. You could do align, establishment, solutions, impact, mobilize. No limit on that. Just one align per fiscal year. And the other question was about the trainee. So if the trainee can be an undergraduate student, absolutely. Um, I don't think we have a set definition for trainee still, which I should probably work on. But we're quite flexible with our definition of trainee. It's basically anyone who doesn't have a formal position to do research. So, yeah. Trainees, so yeah, trainees, undergrads, graduate students, medical residents come up sometimes, community RAs who work as a nurse and are trying to get into research. I usually am open to considering as trainees. Um, And then the next question here, if we have a response to a review comments, so if you've applied before and got feedback, should we upload it to the supplementary? Yes, I think that would be the best spot for it. In establishment, we have a separate field for response to reviewers, but I think for Align, just the supplementary material is the best spot for that. All right, if there's any other questions, I'll stick around for a little while. Otherwise, probably, hopefully tomorrow before I go on holiday, I'll get this follow-up information sent out to everyone that's registered. If I don't get it done, Tanya said she'll do it for me next week, so you'll have the slides and the recording to look back on and share.